Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. As we begin our discussion of this next chapter on English settlement in the Americas, let me begin by reading an excerpt from the account of Captain John Smith and his experiences in the Jamestown colony. Smith wrote, "God being angry with us, plagued us with such famine and sickness that the living were scarce able to bury the dead, our want of sufficient good victuals being the chief cause. Shortly after, it pleased God in our extremity to move the Indians to bring us corn, ere it was half ripe, to refresh us when we rather expected they would destroy us. By the 10th of September, there were about 46 of our men dead." Based on this account, it's no wonder that Thomas Hobbes described life in the colonies as nasty, brutish, and short. So we turn our attention in this chapter to those English colonies. In the last chapter, we left off by talking about some of the conditions that made English settlement possible. And so in this chapter, we'll talk about the process itself, beginning with some of the earliest colonies like Roanoke and Jamestown, and moving on to what become the sort of classic 13 colonies that we all know about as contributing to the American Revolution. We'll talk about the different regions that those colonies are divided up into and the different characteristics of each region. And then we'll conclude by talking about a few of the episodes that occurred during the colonial era in American history that shed some light onto some of the issues that afflicted those English colonies as we went along. So just note, as we look at the map on the screen, we're going to be talking about settlements all along what is today the Atlantic coast, starting out in what we'll describe as the Chesapeake area here. You see Jamestown right here. We will then move to a discussion of the New England colonies, and then the middle colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and that region. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about the Deep South colonies. And we'll be going through each region and discussing some of its characteristics. So remember that in the last chapter, we left off by talking about the conditions that allowed the English to finally think about heading out across the ocean. Recall that they were coming relatively late to this process of exploring the quote-unquote New World. But one of the key events in that process is depicted in this very elaborate painting of Queen Elizabeth. And in the background here you see scenes of the battles between the English Navy and the mighty Spanish Armada, which occurred in 1588. And recall that it was that battle and the defeat of the Spanish Armada which ultimately freed up the English to begin heading out across the ocean relatively unimpeded. Prior to that, their navy was in some senses pinned down and at least held back by the presence of the Spanish and the domination of the Spanish on the seas. But after 1588, the English are more liberated to begin their exploration and ultimately settlement of the Americas. So we're going to begin with a discussion of the first attempt at a settlement in what becomes colonial Virginia, and that is at Roanoke. Now, if we think about Virginia in the time of the American Revolution, it is probably the most sophisticated, highly developed, well-organized of all of the colonies. The commander of the Revolutionary Army and the first president, George Washington, came from Virginia. The author of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, was a Virginian. In fact, 4 out of the first 5 U.S. presidents all came from Virginia. So it evolves into a very well-organized, very productive colony. But if we're looking at the earliest attempts at settlement in what becomes Virginia, we come away with a very different impression of things. And so we're going to be talking about those early attempts in this first lecture or two in this chapter, starting with Roanoke, the famous lost colony of Roanoke. So the process to launch this initial colony begins in the early 1580s. And what we're going to see is that English settlement takes on a different sort of quality than what we saw with the Spanish or others. And they're basing their experiences on England's experience in Ireland. And the process in Ireland, which had really gone on throughout the early 1500s, was one of driving away the Irish, kind of excluding them from certain sections of land, and then establishing plantations that could be farmed by other workers who would be brought in. And ultimately, that is the model that we're going to see in colonial Virginia. This first attempt at a settlement, though, in Roanoke is a colossal failure. Now, it was initiated by private investors, and this is one thing we're going to be talking about. In this case, one of the primary investors was Sir Walter Raleigh, a privateer, adventurer, and soldier who had battled in Ireland and who had battled against the Spanish on the seas. And so Raleigh and others put together this first band of English who would launch this preliminary settlement. The first one being sent in 1584. Just a quick note, of course, that is prior to the defeat of the Spanish Armada. So a group of English ships sailed over to the Americas in what is actually today the Outer Banks of North Carolina and attempted to establish this first settlement known as Roanoke. Now, we know that it is doomed to failure, but let's reflect a little bit on how this happened and why it was not successful. So just note this first batch of settlers included 600 men, no women. Of those 600 men, about 300 were sailors and another 200 or so were soldiers, leaving about 100 who we might describe as settlers, and there were a number of different kinds of folks in there, but many of them were tradesmen, metalsmiths and jewelers and things of that nature. Now we look back in hindsight and say if you want to establish a colony, this is not the greatest sort of model, but think about what they were attempting to do. What kind of expedition are they prepared for? Well, they're thinking along the lines of what Cortez achieved among the Aztecs or Pizarro among the Incas in Peru. They are preparing for a mission of conquest. They're expecting to encounter Native Americans who would provide them with great riches. Then they would conquer those people and enrich themselves. Now, of course, none of that transpired. And so after just a few months of having attempted to start this settlement, the men were suffering greatly. They were starving. A number of them had died. And so they actually leave the colony, leaving behind an outpost of 15 men to kind of hold things down. And then they're going to come back with reinforcements. And that's in some ways what happened. In 1587, another group, this time 110 settlers, land in Roanoke. The 15 who had been left behind were completely vanished. There was no sign of them. Nobody really knows what happened. And then this group of 110 settlers lands in Roanoke. And this is the famous lost colony. They actually, as well, are lost. Now, what happens, unfortunately, for those settlers, if you note the date, 1587, the following year is the clash with the Spanish Armada. And so for several years, the English Navy is preoccupied and not able to send reinforcements as had initially been planned. It's not until 1590, 3 years later, that another ship is sent to reinforce and relieve the 110 who had been sent to Roanoke. When those reinforcements arrive, there is no sign of what we now know as the infamous lost colony of Roanoke. And we can only wonder what might have happened to them. The only possible evidence is a strange word that was carved in one of the doorways, Croatoan. And while no one is entirely certain what is meant by that, many people speculate that perhaps The settlers had carved that into the door as an indication of where they were attempting to go. There was an Indian settlement actually called Croatoan, not too far from there. But we don't know for sure. Did they die from disease? Did they die from starvation or hardship or exposure? Were they perhaps killed by the Indians? Or, as this sort of cryptic word Croatoan perhaps suggests, did they plan to join the Indians and go join them at their colony? Nobody knows, but this is the famous lost colony. So Roanoke becomes important for a couple of different reasons as we start to turn our thinking to the more lasting English settlements to come. On the one hand, this attempt at investment by private investors like Sir Walter Raleigh is a colossal failure. They get absolutely nothing out of it. And so we're going to begin to see the English turning away from this model of private investment. We're going to see going forward the establishment of companies or groups of investors who are going to support similar efforts. The other thing we can take away from Roanoke is more of a question. What do the English learn from this experience? What are they going to do differently going forward? Are they going to change anything as we start to look at other colonial attempts after Roanoke? We will turn our attention to that question in our next lecture about Jamestown.